In the year 1886, Massachusetts stood proudly at the forefront of modern reform. The state had just completed one of its most ambitious projects, a sprawling psychiatric hospital built on a gentle hill overlooking the countryside. The building was an imposing sight, red brick walls rising 3 stories high, rows of white painted columns framing the main entrance, and massive oak doors that seemed to promise safety and dignity to anyone who walked through them. The newspapers called it a palace of mercy. The politicians called it progress for the mentally afflicted. Families across New England took comfort in knowing that their troubled relatives could be sent to a place that would heal the mind and soothe the soul. It was meant to be a sanctuary, a clean break from the grim workhouses and filthy prison wards where the mentally ill had been kept for decades. Inside, the hallways were wide and lined with gas lamps. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the polished wood floors gleamed. At first glance, it looked like the state had finally gotten it right. Each patient had a small iron bed, clean sheets, and a narrow window looking out over the hills. There was even a library, a music room, and a small chapel where prayers were held on Sundays. But as is often the case, what the public saw was only half the story. The asylum, though new, was already straining under its own weight. It had been built to house 400 patients, but within months, more than 700 had been admitted. The staff, poorly paid and overworked, found themselves caring for 3 times the number of people they could reasonably manage. And not all staff were there for noble reasons. Some were untrained laborers or former prison guards who saw the asylum as an easy job with a steady wage. Behind the locked ward doors, away from the eyes of visiting families, conditions were far less refined. Meals were meager, with portions carefully measured to stretch the limited budget. Fresh produce was rare, meat rarer still. Patients were often left hungry, and hunger made tempers short. The so-called healing gardens outside the building were fenced in like prison yards, and access was only granted once or twice a week. There was another shadow over the place, one that came not from neglect, but from secrecy. The asylum superintendent, a tall man named Dr. Horace Wexler, had a stern face and an even sterner manner. He believed in discipline above all else. Patients who resisted orders were restrained for hours or even days. Families who complained too loudly about treatment were told that their loved ones' conditions would worsen without order and stability. And in an era without strict mental health oversight, Wexler's word was law. By the late autumn of 1886, the air inside the asylum had changed. It was not just the draft from the old windows or the damp chill that clung to the basement halls. It was something heavier, a tension that seeped into the walls. Rumors began to circulate among the patients, whispered stories about people who vanished from the wards overnight. At first, staff told them it was simple. Some had been discharged, others had passed quietly in the night. But certain details didn't add up. No funerals were ever arranged. No letters were sent to the families. Most of the patients were too ill, too frightened, or too medicated to question the disappearances. But a few noticed patterns, the same wards losing the same types of patients, those without visitors, those with no one to check on them, those whose names would fade quietly from the records. It was in these shadows between the polished halls shown to guests and the locked wards hidden from them that the truth began to rot. The asylum might have been built for healing, but the people inside were not simply battling their minds anymore. They were battling something far more dangerous, the very place meant to protect them, and so the stage was set. In the heart of a proud and progressive Massachusetts institution, under the watchful eyes of people who claimed to be healers, a slow and terrible secret was taking root. A secret that, before long, would shatter the asylum's respectable facade and horrify the entire nation. By the time winter arrived in late 1886, the Massachusetts asylum's polished image had already begun to crack. Snow drifted against the outer walls, and frost climbed the edges of the window panes. Inside, the air was cold enough that patients could see their breath in the morning. The great coal furnaces in the basement struggled to keep the building warm, but they had another problem pressing against them like a noose tighten. Day by day, there was simply not enough food. The state had quietly slashed the asylum's operating budget, convinced that mental illness could be treated cheaply and efficiently. Deliveries of meat from the local butcher grew smaller and less frequent. Bread came in loaves so stale it had to be soaked in thin broth before patients could chew it. Potatoes were boiled until they fell apart into watery lumps. The so-called supper was often no more than a ladle of greasy soup with little floating in it but onion skins. Hunger, as anyone who has felt it deeply knows, does not just gnaw at the stomach, it gnaws at the mind. Patients began to grow restless, some wandering the halls looking for scraps, others hoarding crumbs of bread under their pillows. The thin bodies of once strong men and women slouched in the wooden chairs of the day room, their eyes dull from malnutrition. A few of the stronger patients stole food from the weaker ones, and fights broke out over something as small as an apple peel. For the staff, the shortage was a daily challenge. The kitchen workers, under strict orders from Dr. Wexler, were told to make do with what you have. But what they had was barely enough to keep anyone alive. The asylum's head cook, a gaunt woman named Mrs. Hanley, often stood staring at her empty pantry shelves, rubbing her hands together as though willing food to appear. Then something strange began to happen. On certain nights when the pantry seemed at its barest, the next day's lunch would suddenly contain generous portions of meat stew. The aroma would drift through the halls, rich, thick, and tempting, and for a few moments, both patients and staff felt relief. Bowls were scraped clean, spoons clinked in unison, but the relief never lasted because the pattern was too odd to ignore. The meat only appeared after a patient went missing. The disappearances at first were brushed aside. Transferred to another facility, the staff would say, taken home by family. But for those who kept their ears open, orderlies, laundry workers, and a few patients who still held on to clarity, the truth seemed less and less like coincidence. One of the missing had been a frail man who never received visitors. Another was a middle-aged woman whose husband had died, leaving her no family. They had simply vanished, and the next day, the stew was richer than it had been in weeks. It wasn't long before fear began to grow alongside hunger. Patients avoided sleeping too deeply. Some refused to eat on days when the stew smelled too rich, pushing their bowls away with trembling hands. Others, too desperate to care, devoured it, convincing themselves it was just pork or beef. The staff, for the most part, looked the other way. A few might have suspected something was wrong, but speaking out meant crossing Dr. Wexler, and crossing Dr. Wexler meant losing your position or worse. Silence became the unspoken rule. In the midst of it all was a young nurse named Eliza Kane, whose quiet eyes missed nothing. She had seen too many patients vanish and too many bowls filled with meat that came from nowhere. Every time she carried a tray down the long hallway of the women's ward, she felt her stomach tighten. Something was wrong here, very wrong, and as the hunger deepened, so did the cruelty. Those in charge of rationing food began favoring certain patients. The ones who cooperated, stayed silent, or were too broken to fight back. Others, particularly those who complained, found their portions smaller and smaller until they were little more than watery broth. The desperation was changing people. Even the patients who had once been gentle and docile began to show signs of aggression. A loaf of bread dropped in the dining hall could cause a frenzy, with hands clawing and teeth snapping. The sound of a locked pantry door could spark shouting matches between the staff and the hungriest patients. Winter in the asylum was always hard, but this winter felt different, darker, as though something beyond neglect was at work, something deliberate. Soon, Eliza would find herself walking toward the truth, lantern in hand, down into the cold, dark belly of the asylum. And there, in the flickering light, she would discover what no one wanted to believe: the hunger was being fed. In a way too horrible to imagine, it was the second week of January 1886 when Eliza Kane's suspicions finally became too heavy to ignore. The snow outside the asylum lay in thick, unbroken drifts, muffling the sound of the wind. Inside, the corridors were quieter than usual, the kind of silence that made every footstep seem too loud. Eliza had noticed it earlier that day. The kitchen had been unusually busy, though no food delivery had come in for over a week. By now she had learned the rhythms of the asylum, when the carts arrived, when the stoves hissed to life, when the smell of boiling broth drifted up from the basement. But that day, the smell was different. It was thicker, richer, almost sweet, and it came with another detail that tightened her chest. Old Mr. Whitlock from Ward C had vanished from his bed the night before. He was frail, half blind, and had no family left. No one had explained where he'd gone. That night, long after the gas lamps in the hallways were dimmed, Eliza made her choice. She wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders, lit the small oil lantern she kept hidden in her room, and slipped out into the main hall. The air was cold enough to sting her nose, but her hands were warm from the tight grip she kept on the lantern's handle. The staircase to the basement was steep and narrow, the wood worn smooth by decades of footsteps. It was officially off limits to nurses after hours, but Eliza had noticed that the door latch was often left unhooked for the kitchen staff. She descended quietly, the faint light casting long shadows on the walls. Halfway down, she froze. Muffled voices echoed up from below, low, urgent, and edged with something she could only describe as nervous laughter. She recognized one of them, Samuel, one of the larger orderlies, a man whose thick hands always seemed too quick to grab a patient's shoulder in restraint. The other voice was deeper and unfamiliar, but the tone was clear. This was no casual conversation. Eliza crouched low, creeping until she could peer through the gap between the stair railing and the wall. What she saw would be burned into her mind forever. In the dim yellow glow of a single oil lamp, two men stood at a heavy wooden table. Spread across it was not the carcass of an animal, but the pale, naked remains of a human body. The skin had a sickly bluish tinge from the cold. One arm dangled off the edge of the table, the fingers slack and lifeless. Eliza's throat tightened, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She forced herself to keep watching, to absorb every detail. Samuel held a long butcher's knife, slicing strips of flesh from the upper leg with practiced precision. The other man, a kitchen worker she'd only seen in passing, placed the pieces into a metal bowl, his face expressionless. The worst part was not just the act itself, but the casual way they did it, as if they'd done it many times before. The sound of the knife scraping against bone turned Eliza's stomach. She wanted to run, to flee up the stairs and never look back, but her feet wouldn't move. Every instinct screamed that if they saw her, she'd end up on that table next. Then Samuel spoke, his voice cutting through the oppressive stillness. "Get the rest of it into the pot. The morning stew needs to be ready by 6. Morning stew." Eliza's stomach lurched as the words sank in. The rich smell in the hallways, the sudden appearance of meat in the meals after a patient's disappearance, it all clicked into place in a single, nauseating moment. The patients weren't just vanishing. They were being served to each other. She backed up slowly, each step deliberate, careful not to let the wooden stairs creak. Her lantern was trembling in her hand, the flame swaying dangerously. When she reached the main floor, she pressed herself against the cold stone wall, gasping silently for breath. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in her room with the lantern unlit, staring into the darkness. The horror of what she'd seen replayed again and again, but alongside the fear, something else began to take root, a resolve. If she stayed silent, the killings would continue. If she spoke, she risked everything, her job, her safety, perhaps even her life. But Eliza had seen enough to know that some truths are worth any cost. The next morning, the smell of the stew was stronger than ever. Patients lifted their spoons, oblivious to what they were about to consume. Eliza walked among them, her expression calm, but her mind was already turning toward the next step, finding proof and finding someone outside these walls who would believe her. The asylum had fed its darkness for too long. And Eliza was done letting it eat in peace. The morning after her discovery, Eliza Kane moved through the asylum like a ghost. Her face was calm, her hands steady, but every movement felt deliberate, as though she were walking a tightrope where one wrong step would send her plunging into danger. She could not afford suspicion, not now, not when she was the only one who knew the full truth. As she passed through the dining hall, she saw it happening again. Bowls of thick, steaming stew were set in front of the patients. A frail woman from ward spooned it into her mouth, smiling faintly as though it were the first good meal in months. Eliza's stomach clenched. Every bite was another piece of the horror hidden in the basement. That day she began to plan. She couldn't simply run to the authorities empty-handed. The asylum was a fortress of lies, run by men who knew how to protect themselves. Without proof, she would be dismissed as hysterical, or worse, silenced before she could speak. The first step was to document everything. In the evenings, after the patients were asleep and the wards were quiet, she took a small leather-bound notebook from her apron pocket and wrote by candlelight. She recorded the names of every patient who went missing, the dates of their disappearance, and the exact days the mysterious meat stews were served. She sketched a rough floor plan of the basement, marking the kitchen and the locked pantry. She wrote down overheard conversations, no matter how small they seemed at the time, but Eliza knew paper alone wasn't enough. She needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away. That meant going back into the basement. The thought made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to do it. Late one night, when most of the staff had retired to their quarters, she crept down the same staircase as before. This time she kept her lantern covered until she reached the bottom, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. She found the wooden table again, stained darker now, the marks of knives etched deep into its surface. A faint smell of iron hung in the air. She moved quickly, her heart pounding in her ears, searching the shelves and drawers. At the back of a cupboard, she found what she was looking for, a small sack wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were bones, human bones. Some still had shreds of flesh clinging to them. Her hands shook as she wrapped the sack in her apron. It was heavy, heavier than she'd expected, but the weight was nothing compared to the burden of the knowledge she carried. She knew she couldn't hide it in her room for long. If anyone searched her quarters, she would be finished. The next morning, Eliza requested leave to visit her ailing mother in a nearby town. The superintendent, Dr. Wexler, gave her a cold look but signed the slip. He had no reason to suspect her yet. That afternoon, with the sack tucked inside a carpet bag, Eliza walked the long road away from the asylum. The snow was deep, and the wind cut through her coat, but she didn't stop until she reached the small-town police station 10 miles away. The desk sergeant looked at her with disbelief as she told her story. His eyebrows knit together as he opened the sack and saw the bones. "Miss Kane, do you realize what you're saying?" he asked slowly. "I do," she replied, her voice steady, "and I have more dates, names, patterns, enough to open that place up and see what's inside." The investigation began within days. Authorities, accompanied by armed deputies, arrived at the asylum unannounced. They searched the basement and found more bones buried in coal ash, bloodstains scrubbed but still visible on the kitchen floor, and a locked pantry containing sacks of preserved human flesh. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers called it the ward of cannibals, and editorials demanded the closure of the asylum. Dr. Wexler was arrested along with several kitchen workers and orderlies. The state promised reforms and greater oversight of all mental health institutions. Eliza testified at the trial, her voice calm but firm. She described what she had seen, what she had documented, and how the patients already among society's most vulnerable had been turned into victims twice over. First by neglect, then by unimaginable cruelty. She could have stayed silent. She could have turned away and told herself it was not her problem, but she didn't, and because she chose to speak, the darkness that had consumed that place was dragged into the light. Years later, when she was asked how she found the courage, Eliza would say only this: "I could live with fear, but I could not live with knowing I had a chance to stop it, and didn't." When the news finally broke, it tore through Massachusetts like a winter gale, cutting to the bone of the public's conscience. Headlines screamed from every newspaper stand: horrors in the Hill Asylum, patients fed human flesh; cannibalism in a state institution, evidence of unspeakable cruelty. The story was too sensational to be ignored and too horrific to be believed without proof. But the proof was undeniable: sacks of human bones pulled from the basement ash heap, blood, soaked planks taken from the kitchen floor, preserved flesh found in the locked pantry. It was all laid out for the public to see, described in chilling detail by journalists who had been allowed into the asylum after the police raid. The public's first reaction was disbelief, then disgust, then fury. Letters poured into the governor's office demanding justice. Families who had entrusted their loved ones to the asylum stormed the gates, desperate for answers. Many left clutching death certificates hastily drawn up by Dr. Wexler's staff documents that could no longer hide the truth. The governor, sensing the political storm brewing, wasted no time. The superintendent, Dr. Horace Wexler, was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of the mentally ill, and desecration of human remains. Alongside him, 5 orderlies and 3 kitchen workers were taken into custody. The trial that followed was one of the most watched events of the decade. The courthouse in Boston was packed every day, the air thick with the smell of ink and sweat as reporters scribbled in their notepads. Photographers jostled for position to capture the grim faces of the accused as they were led in, shackled at the wrists. Eliza Kane was the prosecution's star witness. When she took the stand, there was a hush in the courtroom. She was small in stature, her hair pulled tightly back, but her voice was clear and unwavering. She told the jury what she had seen in the basement, the pale, lifeless body on the butcher's table, the knife-carving strips of flesh, the orderlies discussing morning stew. As though it were a normal task, she presented her notebook, its pages filled with names, dates, and observations, each entry a damning thread in the noose tightening around the defendants. The defense tried to paint her as an unstable woman, overwhelmed by the pressures of her work. They argued that the meat had come from unrecorded deliveries, and that the missing patients had died of natural causes. But every time they tried to twist the narrative, the prosecution countered with more evidence: the bones that matched the dental records of missing patients, the handwriting on falsified transfer papers, the testimony of other staff members who had finally found the courage to speak up after. Eliza broke the silence. Outside the courthouse, the outrage grew. Crowds gathered daily, some holding signs demanding the death penalty, others chanting for reforms in mental health care. Religious leaders denounced the crimes from their pulpits, warning of the moral decay that came when society turned its back on the weak and voiceless. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury returned with its verdict. Dr. Wexler and 2 of the orderlies were found guilty of murder in the first degree. The rest were convicted on charges of manslaughter and abuse. Wexler was sentenced to death by hanging. The others faced lengthy prison terms. The verdict was met with cheers outside the courthouse, but the victory was bittersweet. The families of the victims would never get their loved ones back. The asylum itself was shut down within the year, its red brick walls left to crumble on the hill. Eventually, the building was demolished, but the land was never again used for public purposes. Too many people believed it was cursed. For Eliza, the trial was not an end, but a beginning. She was offered a position on a state commission tasked with inspecting and reforming all mental health facilities in Massachusetts. She accepted, knowing better than most what could happen in places where oversight was weak and silence was the norm. When asked by a reporter if she considered herself a hero, Eliza shook her head. "I'm no hero," she said quietly. "I just refused to look away." Her words became the lasting echo of the case, a reminder that evil often thrives not in the shadows alone, but in the spaces where good people choose not to act. Time has a way of dulling memory, but some stories cling to the human conscience like burrs in fabric, impossible to shake off, no matter how many years pass. The events at the Massachusetts Asylum in 1886 were one such story. They were retold in hushed voices in kitchens, recounted in courtrooms and classrooms, and eventually written into the darker chapters of the state's history. It would be easy to view the ward of Cannibals as a relic of a barbaric past, something belonging only to a time before modern oversight and ethical reform. But the truth is more uncomfortable. The lesson from that winter is not only about what happened, it's about how it happened and why it was allowed to continue for so long. At its core, the horror inside that asylum was made possible by silence. Most of the people who worked there weren't killers, they weren't butchers, but they were witnesses. They saw enough to suspect something was wrong: the missing patients, the strangely plentiful stew, the locked doors no one questioned, and yet they said nothing. Why? Because speaking out was dangerous. It could cost them their jobs, their reputations, even their safety, and so they stayed quiet. That's the first and most enduring lesson. Evil doesn't always roar into the room wearing a monster's face. Sometimes it tiptoes in behind the shield of authority and thrives because no one dares to challenge it. Eliza Kane was not the most powerful person in that institution. She had no high rank, no political connections, and no guarantee she would be believed. But she had one thing most others lacked: the resolve to act. She knew the risks, she understood the danger, and she stepped forward anyway. Her courage reminds us of something vital: change does not always come from those in positions of power. More often it comes from ordinary people who decide they will not look away, even when looking means confronting something horrific. The second lesson is about vigilance. Institutions, whether hospitals, governments, or corporations, are only as ethical as the people who run them, and people are fallible. Without transparency and oversight, even a place built for mercy can become a place of cruelty. The Massachusetts Asylum was designed as a sanctuary, but design alone cannot guarantee humanity. Vigilance is not a one-time act, it is a constant responsibility. Third, this story speaks to the importance of advocacy for the voiceless. The patients in that asylum could not protect themselves. Many could not even articulate what was happening to them. They depended entirely on others to safeguard their well-being. In our own time, those voiceless may be children, the elderly, the disabled, or the marginalized groups that are still too often overlooked, neglected, or exploited. Fourth, it challenges us to reconsider what bravery really means. Bravery is not about fearlessness. Eliza was afraid, terrified. In fact, bravery is about acting despite that fear. We like to think we would do the same in her place, but would we? Would we risk our comfort, our livelihood, even our safety to speak out against something deeply wrong? The fifth and perhaps most haunting lesson is that history has a way of repeating itself when its lessons are ignored. The asylum's horror is an extreme example, but the same dynamics: secrecy, abuse of power, and public complacency can be found in scandals across every era. The forms change, but the mechanics remain chillingly familiar. Finally, there is the lesson of hope. For all its darkness, this story ends with light breaking through. The truth came out. Justice, imperfect though it was served. And reforms were made to protect others in the future. That is no small thing. It is proof that even in the bleakest circumstances, the actions of one determined person can shift the course of events. Eliza Kane did not think of herself as a hero. She did not set out to change history. She simply saw something wrong and refused to accept it. And that choice, made by a single nurse in the frozen winter of 1886, still echoes more than a century later. We may never stand in the exact position she did, lantern in hand, staring at a horror that defies belief. But we will all face moments when we must choose between silence and truth. When that time comes, may we remember her example. Because the most dangerous darkness is not what lives in hidden rooms, it's the kind that grows when good people look away. And the most powerful light is not found in grand speeches or sweeping laws, but in the quiet, determined courage of one person who decides,